This happened a few years ago when I was bartending in college. I was coming home down a stretch of divided highway at around 3 a.m. when I noticed a car heading towards me in the wrong lane. I doubted myself at first and thought the car was on the other side of the highway. Sure enough, the white Ford sedan passed me at a really high speed, at least 90 miles an hour. It's worth noting that I also drive a white Ford sedan. I'm used to drunk and idiotic drivers in the middle of the night, so I pulled to the side of the road and let him pass me. I had a moment of clarity and thought to call the police, thinking this person could hurt themselves or somebody else. The dispatcher answered, and after telling them which road and mile marker I was at, she told me they would send a car. The state police station was only a few exits away, so I figured they would send somebody, and I would just drive home. As I headed back onto the highway, I noticed some lights a few miles behind me. I live in a more rural part of southeastern Pennsylvania, and traffic at 3 a.m. tends to be truckers and cops. The car gained on me as I was getting up to speed, so I stayed in the right lane and waited to be passed. Instead, they flipped on their high beams, making it uncomfortable to drive, and rode my tailgate. At this point, I thought I was going to be pulled over by the police. I drove a white Ford sedan and had just called about a different white Ford sedan, so I grabbed my registration from my glove box. Suddenly, the car behind me audibly slammed on the brakes and stopped in the middle of the highway. They must have shut off their car because the lights went out, and I saw what looked like the same Ford sedan from earlier. Still, I thought this may have been a police car. They had a roof rack, and it could have looked like I had reached for a gun in my glove box or something. I panicked and called 911 for the second time and asked the dispatcher if they had sent a cruiser to investigate. The dispatcher was a little curt with me and assured me that they sent somebody out.
"We have sent a trooper out to find the car, sir,"
I replied. "I only ask because somebody is following me and acting weird. It could be a cop, and I think I freaked them out by getting my registration."
"Okay, are you pulled over?"
"No, they didn't turn on their lights."
"Let me try to get the trooper we sent out."
As she was talking, the car again sped towards me and stopped inches from my bumper. Again, their high beams were on, and again they slammed their brakes. I told the dispatcher, "I'm pretty sure this is not the police behind me." The car sped to my bumper again and turned their high beams on, this time laying on the horn. Hearing this, the dispatcher asked me what was happening.
"What's happening? Did you honk?"
"No, that's the car behind me. I don't think it's a cop."
"I'll try to get the trooper again, but I don't think that's him behind you."
For some reason, this is what shook me. Before that, I was thinking I would get pulled over and maybe get a ticket. Up until then, I was going the speed limit and trying to avoid getting pulled over. I told the dispatcher, "I don't care if I get pulled over, I'm speeding, and if they put their lights on, then I'll pull over." I started to accelerate and the person behind me just kept up with me. The speed limit was 55 and they kept on my bumper the entire time, but this time they were swerving. I tried to signal for an exit, then bail on it, but they followed. At the next exit, I took the off-ramp and continued onto the on-ramp, and the car behind me followed the whole time. I thought about trying to go to a gas station that's pretty much the only populated place in southeastern Pennsylvania at 3 a.m., but the dispatcher and I thought that would be unsafe. She was calm and talking to another person trying to send police to me. The other person, maybe a supervisor, asked if I could drive to the state police station. Realizing that I was one exit away, I told her I was coming there, and she said that she would have troopers meet me outside. As I pulled off to the exit, the car followed me. I blew a few red lights trying to get to the police station, and the car tried to pull into the other lane to pass me or pull up alongside me. Once the police station was in view, I put on my turn signal and the car slammed on its brakes again, turned off their lights and turned into a parking lot. The story ends kinda anticlimactically as I pulled into the police station and met the troopers. Two of them went to find the car, and I stayed with a third trooper. I thanked the dispatcher and her supervisor, and the state trooper escorted me home after taking my statement. I was never called for a follow-up or to testify, so I can only assume the person didn't get caught. This happened a long time ago when I was 21. I was a manager for a big box store, but in a town that was an hour drive from me. I lived in a small town, and the store was in another small town, both about 12K people each. But in order to promote to manager, I had to transfer, which meant doing this drive daily. I had hoped it would be temporary because I dreaded driving this every day, especially late at night because of deer and other dangers from driving at night. This was also before everyone had a cell phone. I did have one, but it was one of those ancient bag-style phones, and I had just got it a week or two before. With these phones, you had to plug them into your car lighter in order to have them work, and they had a corded attached headset. Anyway, one night I was driving home and it was really late, about 1 a.m. The drive is pretty desolate with houses sporadically throughout mixed with sections of wooded areas. About 20 minutes before my town is a random casino in the middle of nowhere. I had just passed this casino, and a truck pulled out behind me. I didn't think anything of it, but it was noticeable pretty quickly that they had been drinking because of their erratic driving. Because of this, I just figured I'd just put as much room between us as possible. Also to note, as I was going past them, they had their headlights on, of course, and could have easily seen I was a young girl by myself. So the truck comes up behind me at a pretty fast rate of speed and goes to pass me. As they are next to me, they swerve a little towards me, and I just think they are much more drunk than I thought, and slowed down so they could easily pass. As soon as they got in front of me, though, they started to slow down, way down. It got to the point that we were going 20 miles an hour in a 55 zone and still slowing down, like they were trying to stop me. Every time they would get to around 5 miles per hour, I would swerve to the opposite lane and give it some gas, like I was going to pass, which would then make them temporarily speed up. I could also see a lot better into the truck at this point. It was an extended cab truck with what appeared to be 5 or 6 guys in it. This was during hunting season, so it wasn't out of the norm to see groups of guys acting ridiculous and drunk this time of year. So they were trying to stop me, and I didn't want to necessarily pass given what had just happened. But at a certain point I had to. So I go to try and pass the truck, but it blocks me from doing so by getting in the middle of both lanes. I try this a couple times with the same results. Then finally I try to floor it and pass the truck, but it tries to run me off the road. I immediately get back behind them and am freaking out at this point. I had tried calling 911, but there was a huge area with no coverage, and I couldn't get through straight away. After what seemed like forever, I finally get through to them, and they send someone out immediately. As I'm on the phone with them, I see headlights in my rear view, and am filled with panic because I know this car will inevitably try to pass, given we are only going about 30 at this point. The car comes up behind us and goes to pass, and sure as heck the truck actually runs them off the road and into the ditch. I'm telling the 911 dispatcher this in a full-blown panic. We are getting close to town now though, and I can see the first stoplight. I wasn't sure what the truck was going to do because our one lane splits into two, and there are gas stations and civilization up ahead. Right as we approach the first light, I see an officer come in the opposite direction and I start flashing them over and over while telling the dispatcher that I see the officer. The officer makes a U-turn and gets in between me and the truck. He flicks his lights on to pull them over, and they pull into a gas station at the main intersection of our town. I follow into the gas station to assist the police in whatever statements they may need, and I want to make sure these a-holes are actually arrested. That didn't end up being a problem because they refused a breathalyzer, so they were taken to the hospital where a blood alcohol level was obtained. I really wanted to know more, but the officer didn't elaborate. I kind of wish I would have called up and followed up on it. They never called me or anything to do anything in court, so I'm guessing they didn't need me. But it also means that they got away with only getting a DUI. I didn't realize this wasn't okay until way later. Much too late to have done anything about it. All I know is the officer said they were all 3 sheets to the wind. God only knows what their intent was, but I was terrified to find out. And thank God for that damn bag cell phone. It might have saved my life that night. To start things off, I'm a female, and was 52 at the time of this story. I was traveling by car to an out-of-town job assignment. I'd stopped at a popular and busy gas station/travel stop to fill up the car, stretch my legs, use the restroom, and grab a snack. I was approached by a developmentally disabled woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. She was looking for a ride to a town a couple of towns over. Her ride had abandoned her while she was in the restroom. She was a little upset. She didn't have a cell phone and didn't know any phone numbers, so I couldn't call anyone for her. I checked with the employees at the store, and they said that she had been there for an hour looking for a ride because she said her friends left her while she was in the restroom. I then made the decision to do something I've never done before: offer a stranger a ride. I wasn't going to the town she wanted to go to, but I was heading in that direction, and I told her I could drop her off at the grocery store in the next town, where I would be turning off to go to my destination. The grocery store was always busy, and it was very likely she'd have an easier time getting a ride to where she wanted to go. Also, she'd be 5 miles away from where she wanted to go instead of 25 miles, and she'd have an easier time walking that distance if she had to. This was agreeable to her, and we set off. Right away, I noticed a van following us. I tried to lose the van, but it kept pace. Meanwhile, the woman wanted to play with my phone. I told her no, it wasn't a toy, it was for work, and I moved it out of her reach. The van speeds up and starts to get closer. The woman suddenly remembers her boyfriend's phone number, and we need to call him. I can't use my phone while driving, and I was approaching the outskirts of the business district of next town, and no cell phone use while driving signs everywhere. I told her, "We're almost to the grocery store. We can call him from the parking lot." She becomes agitated and yells,
No, you have to take me home.
"I told you I can't do that. I'm not going there. It's in the opposite direction of where I need to go, and I'm expected soon. We'll call him from the parking lot." She becomes more upset and frustrated. Meanwhile, the van is still following us, and it's getting closer. I pull into the grocery store parking lot. It's about 4 p.m. The grocery store was still busy at this hour. I pull up in front of the store and ask for her boyfriend's number. Then she says she can't remember his number and won't get out of the car. As she's arguing with me, I notice the van is pulling into the parking lot. There is a sheriff's deputy parked nearby, so I roll down my window and signal that I need to speak to him. He walks over and asks me what's going on. I tell him where I met the woman, and now she won't get out of the car, and under my breath I tell him the van has been following us. The deputy tells the woman, "She brought you where you asked her to. It's time for you to leave her car now." She slowly gets out of the car, and I ask once more for her boyfriend's number, and she says,
You're crazy. I don't have a boyfriend. Oh, look, there are my friends now.
and she points to the damn van. The deputy and I share a look, and he says, "Give me your contact info. I can delay them for about 20 minutes while I check their license and registration and lecture them about abandoning a special needs adult. You get out of here and I'll check on you before my shift is over. And don't pick up any more hitchhikers." I left and went on to my destination. He called me to make sure I got to where I was going and told me that they were keeping an eye on the van and its owner. He told me he also contacted a colleague at the sheriff's department in the county where I was working, and that she would contact me in a day or two. While I was on assignment there, I spoke to 2 deputies and a detective about the woman in the van. No one ever told me anything about them, but they were very interested in them. My nightmare is one day I'll turn on a true crime show and see a report about this woman and her gang robbing people or something worse. This happened quite a long time ago, yet it is never too far from my mind. We continue to feel very lucky to have survived whatever might have happened. It was a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a mom in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Macon, Georgia doctor's office was an hour away from our home, and I was just taking the 2 youngest of my 3, they were 1 and 3 years old at the time, to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, which we were very grateful for. The doctor had just built a new building off of a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction, but a very nice facility compared to his old spot by the hospital there. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car, a black Jeep Cherokee we had owned for 2 years, was one of only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot when arrived. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and finally exited back outside. Mine was the only car left in the lot as I loaded the children in their car seats for our trip home. But as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car somehow wouldn't start when I turned the key. There was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in and asked to borrow their phone to call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said that he would come, but that it might be a bit, so I told him my location, left to go back out to the car, rolled down all the windows, and loaded the children back into their seats once more as we waited. Soon we watched as all the lights were turned out in the building again and everyone left, their cars departing one by one from behind the building somewhere, leaving us now completely alone in the parking lot. As it was still light, I spent a lot of that time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks and a bottle, making sure that they weren't getting too hot or anything. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to be quite a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot pretty soon, and a man got out of his pickup, smiled and nodded to me, and said he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged and a bit scruffy, but quite frankly many service station attendants sometimes look that way, especially at the end of the day, and I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking the connections, and I longed for him to just grab jumper cables. Yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong, and he said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire, not the battery," and continued whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood as we waited. More than once, he said that it was just a loose wire, and if I would just come up here really quick, he would show me which one it was, so it would never happen again. I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that sadly, there was no reason to show me anything, as I didn't know anything about cars. I just thanked him and continued to stay in the driver's seat, again just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition that was most surely coming any moment. At one point I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting as he spoke, but I was trying above all to be polite and kind, as he was indeed helping us. We were hot, tired, and miserable, and truthfully I was distracted with the kids. Oddly enough, he was starting to sound a little frustrated with me, because I wouldn't come up and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad to where he would leave us there all alone, with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into that desolate parking lot, and as it did, this nice guy working underneath the hood suddenly slammed it shut, ran to his truck, started it, and drove away very abruptly, without even saying a word. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was now arriving. I even remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me there alone with two little ones, defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed the southerly gentleman thing to do. I looked around and was very aware once again that there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new, also unmarked pickup pulled in next to me, I got out of the car once again, this time more apprehensively. Upon exiting, though, he immediately introduced himself, and his name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone much earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, pointing and asking who the man was that had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I don't know. I thought all this time he was you." And we both laughed slightly as he then grabbed jumper cables, walked to the front of my car, raised the hood, and started to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that with some luck, that air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly, and once again checking the children. While listening for the familiar words, "Try it," I had my back completely turned towards the children, when he surprised me by suddenly coming to the driver's side door. In the strangest voice, he said, "Ma'am, is this yours?" And when I looked into his hands, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like thing that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish rust, yet on one end it had tiny circular small finger holes, as if it was a mix of a long, thin sword and scissors, oddly combined. I remember being amazed, but not frightened, and I asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I said, just matter-of-factly, that I had never seen them before. But how weird was it that those things had somehow been stuck and undiscovered in my car for all those years, and shook my head in surprise. He continued to stand there and stare at them, unbelievingly, and he looked oddly pale too, Like he couldn't find the words to speak for a bit, just continuing to stare at the unusual object. Honestly, I didn't care one bit about it. All I could think of was getting the car going, letting me pay him, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just quickly set them on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled for me to start the Jeep, and when it immediately started, my 3-year-old cheered. Grateful, I quickly turned on the air conditioner full blast, rolled up all the windows, aimed the air vents back towards the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay out. I stood up and took a few steps to meet him so I could hear the amount now owed. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up that weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time," and held them out for closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and actually really looked. In his hands, the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet-looking quality, except for the strangely small 2 loops on one end. I'd never seen anything like it and told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me, as if trying desperately to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They hadn't been there very long at all, 'cause they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there." I shook my head no, and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but see how sharp they are? These look like they've just been sharpened." And when I looked down, he was right. The long, skinny, dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip where the rust had been removed were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted the item. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it at all, but I opened the back window so he could place it inside. Then we both left the lot together, him turning one way, me turning the other toward the small, winding highway that would lead home, still an hour away. I did indeed contact the Macon police the moment that we arrived home, and I got the children inside safely, but although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like thing to them. The officer I spoke to said that they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears from my description and measurements on the phone, which I found quite disturbing, as you can imagine. I remember wondering how he would even know that, why he would say that. I had tried so carefully not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping that they might be able to lift prints or test it for blood if they wanted, but the story seemed to bore him a bit, and he didn't seem interested. His attitude insinuated that, as there was no longer an emergency, it was of no importance now. At the very end of the call, as if to wind things up, he did say that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep the shears for a few days, just in case someone from his office got back with me later. But that was all. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper and placed them in the brick shed behind our house. And there they remained for several more years, untouched, until we moved away, and I finally, not wanting to bring them across several states, reluctantly threw them in the trash. Around that time, though, if you look through old news reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if the service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did, if my children would still have a mother, if I would have still had my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know, but I learned something very important about myself that day. I had always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people and staying safe, but because I was exhausted, tired, and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a bit and wasn't working at that time. And many of my friends and family still think that our car trouble that day and my lack of awareness could easily have cost us our lives.
Don't skip this.